My son Joel stood in the middle of his studio launch party, raised a glass of champagne in front of 40 people he'd known for less than a year, and thanked everyone in the room by name, except me. I had driven 6 hours from Thunder Bay to Toronto in February sleet. I had written the check that paid for the equipment filling every corner of that room. I had sold the lakeside lot your father and I bought together 30 years ago. The one we always said we'd build a retirement cabin on someday, because Joel told me this was his one real chance. And when he finally looked in my direction, he smiled the kind of smile you give a stranger whose name you've almost forgotten. Then he turned back to his friends. I didn't cry that night. I think I was too surprised to cry. I drove back to my hotel through streets glazed with ice, sat on the edge of the bed in my coat, and stared at the wall for a long time. Outside, Toronto hummed the way big cities do. Indifferent, continuous, enormous. I thought about my husband Gary, who died of a stroke 3 years earlier at 61, 2 weeks before he would have retired. Gary was a high school shop teacher in Thunder Bay for 34 years. He wasn't a man who talked about feelings easily, but he showed up for everything. Every school play, every hockey game Joel ever played, every Sunday dinner. The morning he died, he was standing at the kitchen sink washing his coffee mug, and then he wasn't standing anymore. That's how fast a life can change. After Gary died, the silence in that house became something I had to learn to live inside. Joel called more often at first. He came up for Christmas. That first year helped secrete some of his father's things, helped me clear out some of his father's things. There was a softness between those months that I think grief brought. When they've both lost the needs in the same person and neither of them knows what to say about it. Then about 18 months after Gary died, Joel called me one evening while I was making soup and told me he had an idea. He'd been working as a sound engineer at a radio station in Toronto for 4 years. Steady work, decent pay, but not what he wanted. What Joel wanted. What he had always wanted since he was 14 and recording his own music on a second-hand laptop in his bedroom, was to run his own music production studio. A real one, he said, professional grade. The kind where emerging artists could come in and actually build something. I remember stirring the soup and listening to the excitement in his voice. He sounded the way he did as a boy when something genuinely lit him up from the inside. Faster, louder, slightly breathless. "Mom," he said, "this could actually be something. There's a space on Dundas Street. It's the right size. The rent is manageable if I can cover equipment costs up front. I've been talking to people. There's real interest." "What kind of interest?" I asked. "Artists. Producers." He paused. "And there's this woman, Tamara Voss. She does brand development for music businesses. She's helping me think through the whole thing strategically." I remember asking who Tamara Voss was. Joel described her as someone with connections in the industry, someone who had helped other independent studios launch. I asked how he knew her. He said she'd reached out to him after hearing a production he'd done for a local artist. I thought nothing of it at the time. I thought nothing of it for too long. I told Joel I needed to think. Then I spent 2 weeks thinking about Gary. Gary and I had talked about retirement carefully, the way people who never had extra money talk about money. Seriously, quietly, without illusions. We had the house, a modest savings account, Gary's teacher pension, and the lot by the lake. The lot was the one thing we'd bought that felt like a dream instead of a necessity. Birch trees along the waterline, a particular quality of light in the late afternoon. Gary always said we'd find the right time to build on it. We never quite did. I decided to sell it. Not impulsively. I thought it through for 2 full weeks, called my friend Ruth Ann Shepard, who talked sense to me when I needed it, and ultimately decided that Gary would have wanted Joel to have a chance. Joel was our only child. Gary believed in him. And I believed in Gary. The lot sold in March. I sent Joel the money in 2 installments. He called both times sounding overwhelmed and grateful. "You're incredible, Mom. I'm going to make you so proud. I'm going to make this mean something." I pressed the phone against my ear and tried not to cry, because the gratitude sounded so much like Gary, when Gary was young and something good had happened, and he didn't quite know how to hold it. The first months of the studio's setup were exciting to hear about. Joel sent photographs. The space had exposed brick and old wood beams and natural light from tall factory windows, the kind of room that photographs beautifully. He called it Birchwood Sound, which broke something open in my chest when I heard it, because birch trees, lake water, your father. I wasn't sure Joel remembered all that, but I didn't ask. He did mention Tamara Voss in almost every call during those months. Tamara thinks we should build the brand before the booking calendar. Tamara connected me with someone at a management company. Tamara says studios that launch quietly never break through. I listened and nodded along because what did I know about the music industry? I was a retired dental office manager from Thunder Bay. But something small began bothering me, the way a sound bothers you before you can identify where it's coming from. It started with money. Not dramatically. Joel mentioned he needed a bit more for acoustic paneling, and the amount sounded reasonable, so I transferred it. A few weeks later, the soundproofing quote came in higher than expected. Then he needed funds for a custom mixing console he'd found secondhand but still required restoration. I kept thinking each request was the last, the way you do when you want something to be true badly enough. Over 8 months, I gave Joel more money than I had planned to give. Each time he explained it carefully. Each time it made sense in isolation. Each time I told myself this was an investment in something real. But the numbers, when I finally added them up one sleepless November night at my kitchen table, made my hands go cold. I'd spent nearly everything the lot had given me. What remained was a small buffer and my monthly pension. Around that same time, Joel's calls became shorter, less frequent. When I asked specific questions about the studio's bookings or income, the answers were vague. "We're building momentum, Mom. These things take time. The industry moves slowly. Tamara says patience is the whole game right now. Tamara says. I had never met Tamara Voss, but she had become the most frequent presence in every conversation I had with my son. I flew to Toronto in December, unannounced. Not because I was suspicious exactly, but because I needed to see the studio with my own eyes, and because I missed my son, and because Gary had always said that when something feels wrong, you go find out what it actually is instead of waiting for someone to tell you. The studio was real. I want to say that clearly. Birchwood Sound existed. It was operational. It was genuinely beautiful in the way the photographs had suggested. Joel gave me a tour with obvious pride, and I felt it too. The pride. Because those wood beams and that mixing console and the little acoustic booths with their soft lighting, Joel had built something real inside the money I had given him. But Tamara Voss was there, and she changed the temperature of every room she was in. She was perhaps 40, polished and quick in the way of someone who had learned to read rooms before anything else. She smiled at me warmly and immediately. "You must be Joel's mother. He talks about you constantly." I nodded and smiled back, and noticed that she did not say what it was that Joel said about me. She pivoted immediately to discussing the studio's brand strategy, the social presence she was building, the media contacts she'd been cultivating. I watched Joel while she talked. He tracked her the way young people track someone they've decided is the most important person in the room. Not romantic, or at least I didn't think so. Something more unsettling than that. A kind of total professional faith that had quietly replaced his own judgment. That evening, Joel took me to dinner, just the two of us. I waited until we'd ordered before saying what I needed to say. "How much is Tamara costing you?" He looked up from the menu. "She's worth every dollar, Mom." "That's not what I asked." "She works on a consulting retainer. Her rates are industry standard." I folded my hands on the table. "What company does she bill through?" He paused just a beat too long. "Voss Creative. It's her firm, and she owns it." "Yes, Joel, she's billing her own company out of the studio's budget." He set the menu down. "That's completely normal in this industry." "Is it?" I looked at him carefully. "Do you know how many other studios she's currently working with?" He didn't answer. "Joel, she's focused on Birchwood right now." I looked at my son. 31 years old. His father's exact jaw and his father's exact habit of looking slightly to the left when he didn't want to hold your eyes, and felt the first real stab of fear. Not the manageable worry I'd been carrying for months. Actual fear, cold and specific. I said I thought we should look at the financial records together before the end of my visit. Joel's face shifted in a way I hadn't seen before. Defensive, yes, but underneath the defense was something else, something exhausted. "You don't trust me," he said. "I trust you completely," I said. "I don't know Tamara Voss at all. He didn't arrange for me to see the records." He called it a difficult visit. He drove me to the airport 2 days early and hugged me in the departures lane with his arms stiff at his sides. I flew home to Thunder Bay, to the Too Quiet house, to Gary's reading chair, still positioned at the same angle in the living room window, and I sat down and let myself feel what I'd been pushing away for months. That my son had become someone I didn't fully recognize. That the woman at the center of his professional life had more of his attention than his own family. That the money I'd sold Gary's dream to give him was moving somewhere I couldn't see. I called Ruth Ann Shepard the next morning. Ruth Ann had worked in small business accounting for 20 years before she retired, which is why I called her specifically. She listened without interrupting, which is the greatest kindness I know. Then she said, quietly, I think you need to look at this like a business problem, not a family problem. Just for nows. She offered to help me organize what I knew. I drove to her house with the transfer records, the emails Joel had forwarded about studio expenses, and the few invoices I'd seen. Ruth Ann made tea and put on her reading glasses and worked through the papers methodically for 2 hours. At the end, she looked at me over the rims of her glasses. These consulting fees are large for a studio with minimal booking income. And this billing structure, she pointed to one invoice. She earns more when spending increases. I stared at the page. She gets a percentage of expenditure, not a flat fee. Ruth Ann nodded. Which means the more Joel spends, the more Tamara earns, regardless of whether the spending generates revenue. I thought about all the times Tamara had encouraged bigger thinking, larger equipment purchases, more extensive marketing, industry events that cost money to attend. Each time, Joel reported her encouragement like a forecast. I thought I'd been listening to sound advice. I'd been listening to someone's income strategy. What do I do? I asked. Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, you stop adding money to the account, and you ask to see everything. I didn't go back to Toronto immediately. I wrote Joel an email instead, careful and clear. I told him I loved him. I told him I had concerns about the financial structure of Tamara Voss's consulting arrangement. I told him I was not able to provide any further funding until I had reviewed complete financial records, including all payments to Voss Creative. I told him I hoped we could do this together. His response came 4 hours later. It was the longest email he had ever sent me. He said I was undermining his confidence at a critical moment. He said I was letting fear turn into control. He said Gary, his father, my dead husband, would have understood risk because Gary had always supported Joel's dreams, unlike me, apparently, who was now revealing what I actually thought of him. I read that email 3 times. The 3rd time, I put my phone down and walked out to the backyard and stood in the February cold until my face went numb. Gary had worked 34 years in a high school wood shop, teaching teenagers to build things with their hands. He believed in doing work that was real and honest and leaving things better than you found them. He did not believe in spending money you didn't have to impress people you didn't know. He would not have recognized the version of his son this email was written by. I did not reply that day. I called Joel the following morning, and when he answered I said only this: I'm not going to argue through email. I love you. I'm not sending more money until I see the records. That's where He hung up. He called back 4 days later. The call was short and strange, the kind of conversation where someone is managing you rather than talking to you. He told me Tamara had suggested a formal meeting, that she felt it might help clear up some of the misunderstandings around her role. He made it sound like a generous offer. I agreed to come to Toronto. But I called Ruth Ann first, and then I called a lawyer named Patricia Osei, whose name I found through the Thunder Bay Legal Referral Service. Patricia practiced business law and had experience with small entertainment companies. She agreed to review documents with me before any meeting took place. On the train to Toronto, I looked out the window at the frozen landscape scrolling past. The boreal forest, the granite outcrops, the rivers still locked under ice, and thought about the last long train journey I'd taken, which had been with Gary the year before he died, when we went to Montreal for our 32nd anniversary and sat in the dining car drinking wine and talking about everything and nothing for hours. Gary could talk about nothing in a way that felt like everything. I missed that. I missed being known that completely. The meeting was held at the studio. Joel was there. Tamara Voss arrived last, which I suspected was deliberate. The kind of entrance that resets a room. She was warmer than before, if anything. She brought good coffee and spoke about her genuine admiration for what Joel had built and her commitment to his long-term success. She said she understood I had questions and that transparency was a value she held deeply. I placed a folder on the table between us. My questions were written out. Patricia had helped me formulate them. I asked how Tamara's compensation was calculated. She explained the percentage arrangement as industry standard, which is what Joel had said. I asked what percentage. She named a number. I asked whether the percentage applied to all studio expenditures or only to those she specifically recommended. The room went quiet for 2 seconds too many. Joel interjected. "Mom, this is getting confrontational." I looked at him. "I'm asking questions, Joel." Tamara smoothed things over quickly and redirected. She talked about the studio's potential, about the artists who had expressed interest, about a licensing opportunity she'd been exploring with a media company in Vancouver. Everything sounded forward-facing and almost plausible. This, I understood now, was her skill. She was excellent at making the future sound so specific and bright that you forgot to look at the present. I waited until she finished. Then I asked for the financial records. Every payment, every invoice, every contract. I said I would need a week to review them before any further conversation about the studio's direction. Tamara looked at Joel. Joel looked at the table. That look told me everything I hadn't been able to prove yet. "I'm not trying to take control of the studio," I said, keeping my voice very steady. "I'm trying to understand where the money I gave my son has gone. That's a reasonable thing for a mother to ask." Tamara pivoted gracefully. "Of course. We'll put together a full financial summary." She made it sound like she was doing me a favor. 3 days later, what they sent was not a full financial summary. It was a curated document, clean, professional looking, with large categories and almost no line item detail. Patricia looked at it and said, in the tone she used when things were worse than expected, "This tells us very little." I forwarded it to Ruth Ann, who said the same thing in slightly more colorful language. That night, sitting in my Toronto hotel room, I made a decision. I wasn't going to send another $1. I wasn't going to sign anything. I was going to go home, and I was going to stop pretending that the money I had already given was protected just because I needed it to be. And then Joel called. His voice, when I answered, was a register I hadn't heard since he was a teenager and something had gone genuinely wrong. Lower, quieter, flattened by something I couldn't immediately name. "Mom, I need you to come to the studio tomorrow morning. Not for a meeting, just to talk. Just us." I almost said I'd already booked my return train. Instead, I said, "I'll be there at 9. He was alone when I arrived. No Tamara. The studio was quiet the way rooms are when equipment is resting. A kind of held breath. Joel had coffee ready, and he poured 2 cups without speaking and set one in front of me at the small table near the window where the February light came in gray and flat. He sat down and looked at his hands for a long time. "I found something," he said finally. I waited, in the shared drive. From before she changed the folder permissions, he looked up. "Mom, she has contracts with 2 other studios right now. Active ones. Full retainer arrangements like ours." I kept my voice even. "What does that mean for Birchwood?" "It means she told me she was working exclusively with us." He pressed both hands flat against the table. "It also means some of the connections she said she was building. The Vancouver licensing thing. The management company she introduced me to. Those were things she was already doing for the other studios, not for us specifically." The room was very quiet. "Joel," I said carefully, "how much has gone to Voss Creative since the beginning?" He named a number. "It was higher than anything Ruth Ann or I had estimated." He said it quietly, the way people say things they've been ashamed to look at directly. I didn't say I told you. I didn't say anything for a moment, because what I was feeling wasn't satisfaction or anger exactly. It was grief. A specific kind of grief for the money, yes, but more than that. For the months, Joel had spent trusting the wrong person so completely that he'd forgotten to trust his own mother even a little. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He didn't pull away. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I don't know if I can save it," he said. "The studio. There's not enough in the account to last another 2 months and stare at bookings if I can't bring in bookings." "Is there any booking income at all?" "Some. I have 3 independent artists who've been using this space regularly. One of them referred 2 others last week. It's not nothing." "No," I said. "It isn't. I went home to Thunder Bay 3 days later. The legal process that followed was Patricia Ossie's territory, not mine. She identified several aspects of Tamara Voss's contracts worth challenging, including the exclusivity misrepresentation and certain billing irregularities that warranted a formal complaint to the relevant regulatory body. Whether any of it would result in recovery, Patricia told me honestly, was uncertain. These things take time. Justice, when it comes, usually comes incomplete. What I knew was this: I was not going to send more money. I was not going to rescue Joel from the consequences of choices that had also been his to make. He was 31 years old and he had spent my son's inheritance. That's how I thought of it. Gary's money, the money from Gary's dream, partly on someone who had not been honest with him. That would take time to sit with for both of us. Joel called more often after that, not always easily. Some calls were short and stilted and ended with neither of us quite saying what we meant. But he called, and I answered. In March, he drove up to Thunder Bay for the first time since Gary's second anniversary memorial. He arrived late on a Friday evening, after 7 hours on the highway, and I made him the lamb stew his father used to request every winter. And we sat at the kitchen table together for 3 hours talking, more honestly than we had in years. He told me things I hadn't known. That the year after Gary died, he had felt unmoored in a way he didn't have the language for at the time. That the studio idea had started partly as grief, partly as proof to himself that he could build something Gary would have been proud of, even without Gary there to say so. I thought if I could just make it work, he said, then somehow the whole thing would mean something. Dad would mean something. I looked at my son across the table. He looked like his father. He looked like the boy who used to sit in Gary's woodshop after school doing homework on the workbench while Gary finished his marking. I said, "Your father always meant something. Before the studio. Before the money. Before any of this," Joel cried then. Not quietly. Real crying, the kind that bends people over their coffee cups. I let him because there are times when the most useful thing a mother can do is simply stay in the room. Later, after the dishes were done, and Joel was on the couch with his old high school blanket that I had never thrown out, because I am the kind of person who keeps things, he asked me something that had clearly been sitting with him for a long time. "Do you think Birchwood can still work?" I thought about it, honestly, before answering. I think the room is real. I think the equipment is real. I think the 3 artists who keep coming back are real. Whether that's enough, that's your question to answer. Not mine. He was quiet for a moment. She told me the studio was nothing without her connections. I looked at him. "And what do you think?" He considered it. I think I knew more than she gave me credit for. I just stopped trusting myself somewhere along the way. That, I thought, was exactly right. Birchwood Sound didn't close. I want to be clear about that, because sometimes stories that begin in collapse end there, and this one didn't. Joel renegotiated his lease into a smaller footprint and reduced his overhead significantly. He let go of the brand strategy and the social consultants and the carefully curated image and started booking the studio the way he originally knew how to. By word of mouth, by reputation, by doing good work and letting the work talk. It was slower. It was quieter. It looked nothing like what Tamara Voss had told him success would look like. It looked more like his father. Steady, honest, showing up. By summer, he had enough regular bookings to cover costs. By fall, he called me on a Sunday evening and told me, without drama, that Birchwood had turned a profit for the first time. Small, he said, but real. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to my son sound like himself for the first time in years and thought about Gary, who I still talked to, sometimes, late at night, when the house was very quiet, usually about Joel, usually asking questions neither of us could answer anymore. "He's going to be okay," I told the empty kitchen. "I think you would have liked what he's building now. The lot by the lake is gone. That's a permanent thing. And I've made my peace with it, mostly. Some of the money it took years to save went somewhere I didn't intend, and some of it went somewhere it needed to go. And it's not always possible to separate those things cleanly after the fact. What I know is this: love that doesn't include honesty isn't love, it's performance. And a dream that requires you to stop seeing the people who love you clearly isn't a dream anymore. It's something else. Something that belongs to the person selling it to you." Joel came back to Thunder Bay for Christmas that year. He brought a bottle of rye. whiskey, and the lamb stew ingredients because he'd learned his father's recipe, which I hadn't known. And he stood in that kitchen for 2 hours, following Gary's index card in Gary's handwriting, and produced a stew that wasn't quite the same as his father's, but was close enough to make both of us quiet for a moment after the first spoonful. If you've ever had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting someone you love, you know how impossible that choice feels. What I've learned finally at 63 years old, in a house that's too quiet and a kitchen that still smells like coffee and wood shavings on the mornings I imagine Gary hardest, is that sometimes those two things are not opposites. Sometimes the most loving thing is the harder thing, the thing that doesn't rescue, the thing that says, I see you, I believe in you, and I will not carry you past the point where the carrying stops being love. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to hold a boundary with someone you love more than anything? Tell me what you decided, and let me know where you're watching from today. What city? What time is it there? I read every single one.